So when you get into government, you realize that the priority is not efficiency. The priority is openness. The priority is participation. The priority is transparency. And every one of those things is inefficient and builds in inefficiencies.
This is Office Hours, and I'm your host, Spencer Rascoff. I co-founded Zillow and ran it for a decade. And in early 2020, I co-founded .la, the preeminent news service covering the tech scene in my hometown of Los Angeles. On this show, you'll hear from founders, CEOs, and thought leaders from around the world with a focus on the innovators in LA. Mayor Stephen Adler is an American lawyer and politician who is the 58th and current mayor of Austin, Texas. A Democrat, Adler was first elected in the 2014 mayoral race and was re-elected in 2018. Mayor Adler has received recognition for his innovative ideas and leadership. In January 2018, Mayor Adler was elected vice president of the National Council of Democratic Mayors. And in June 2017, his fellow mayors elected Mayor Adler a trustee of the U.S. Conference of Mayors after putting him on the advisory board the previous year. Mayor Adler was born in Washington, D.C. and attended Princeton and later the University of Texas Law School on scholarships and while working part-time jobs. For over 20 years, he has worked and chaired many of Austin's largest civic and nonprofit boards and has served as board chair of the Texas Tribune. He has fought discrimination and promoted the benefits of diversity as chair of the Anti-Defamation League. Adler has been a practicing attorney in Austin in the areas of eminent domain and civil rights law for 35 years. Mayor, welcome to Office Hours. It's great to have you here.
It's great to be with you. Thanks.
So as you know, .la focuses on the LA tech community, and it's trying to lift up LA tech and help make Los Angeles achieve its full potential. But I'm going to do something a little bit risky here, which is I want to start this conversation by asking you to pitch Angelenos who are in the business community here, in the tech community. Why should they consider Austin? What is so great about Austin? Go ahead, pitch.
Well, I think Austin's a pretty magical city. LA is a wonderful city too, and we're not trying to encourage anybody to leave. But there's something organic. There's something in the water, in the air, I think, in Austin. Pretty geometric growth here recently. In the last 10 years, Austin is the fastest growing large metropolitan area in the country. Pretty amazing for an extended period of time like that. But it's the same rate of growth that the city of Austin, the region, has had since 1850.
Wow.
Doubling in population every 20 to 25 years. So there's something there. There are a lot of ways, I think, that Austin is culturally different. So many people pass through Austin and then don't leave. Me, for one. I grew up in Washington, D.C., went to college outside of New York, came down for law school only because it was the cheapest law school in the country, and I could afford it. But I had no intention of staying. I stayed. I think that it is a really friendly city. It's an entrepreneurial and an innovative city. I think the real distinguishing factor in Austin is that it has a higher tolerance for taking risk than any city I've been in the world. Most cities in the world, you try something, you fail. It's hard to have access to the Capitol the second time or to be invited into the same rooms the second time. In Austin, the civic folk heroes are the people that tried something and it didn't quite work out, and then they worked on it till it did. And that risk tolerance also tracks, I think, the business model for what we're seeing right now in startup tech.
Of course. I mean, a hallmark of entrepreneurialism is the risk of failure and the acceptance and, in fact, the embracing of that risk of failure. So you're saying that there's something about the city that accepts failure and that encourages risk-taking and, therefore, entrepreneurship and startups in particular.
In fact, the watchword for the city is Keep Austin Weird. You could buy it on a T-shirt or a mug.
Yeah.
And that's what that means.
Yeah, so let's talk about that, Keep Austin Weird. How do you stay weird when you have all these Californians and others moving there and building tall buildings and creating, more urban sprawl as the city grows? I mean, how do you maintain that unique culture that makes Austin, Austin, even as the city grows?
Consciously and deliberately, I think, because I'm not sure that it happens on its own. But Austin has always done change well, but still been able to maintain that culture. I joke with a lot of people. I got to Austin in 1978, and when I hear people complaining about the folks coming in from California now, I remind them that the folks who got here with me are sure that the people who started getting there in 1979 were the ones that started screwing up the place. But I think it's a deliberate thing, and one is it's maintaining the people, and that's our existential challenge right now. We want to be a city that continues to create art everywhere. And when we look at other cities that earlier on the path that we're on right now, they evolved into cities that consumed massive quantities of art, but stopped creating art everywhere.
So what cities do you look at, perhaps globally, as having done this well? I mean, who do you emulate?
We haven't found one. We haven't found one that we think has been able to grow at this pace, sustain it, and still maintain the people. Affordability issues come along really early. We're facing them now. So how do you keep the people there that create, that are the diversity, that create the friction, that drive the innovation, drive the art, cross-discipline? That's our challenge right now.
One of the most pressing issues facing every city in the country is homelessness. How have you and the city of Austin tackled homelessness?
Well, it's been quite a journey here over the last 10 years, and certainly over the last 3. Austin's homelessness challenge about average, maybe on the high side of average across the country. Nothing like what you're seeing in L.A. or San Francisco. But it became real apparent to me that if we didn't do something, our numbers would soon start escalating, only because we had a challenge that was growing. And we are the epicenter for increased housing costs and prices, which is the largest single corollary to increased homelessness. I actually visited L.A. and San Francisco and Seattle and Portland and asked the question, because I have no idea what those cities do now. The scale of the challenge is so great. What do you wish you'd done 10 years ago that might have been able to help you avoid being where you are today?
What did they tell you?
They all gave me the same answer. They said it is now one of the hottest political issues in our city. Everyone talks about it. Elections turn on it. We're finally putting real resources against it. But the scale is so big, it's just really tough to manage. I wish it had become a political issue the same way 10 years ago.
And what they could have done differently 10 years ago was change permitting to allow more construction and more housing development?
100 different things. Also building out the homelessness response system. You know, if you're in a city that's arguing about whether or not you should be doing more emergency relief so that people are not dealing with people experiencing homelessness on their beaches, those advocates versus the advocates that are arguing for permanent supportive housing, which takes longer to set up but is a lot more effective in keeping people off the street. If you're in a city that's having that debate, it's usually a sign of economic politics, of politics where there's a scarcity politics, where there's not really enough to do both of them. And I think it's real clear from watching cities that unless you do both, unless you do the entire spectrum, then it's going to fail. You actually need the system, and that's what we're setting up in Austin right now. It's expensive to start, but once you start, it'll get set up. I think it's a $500 million ask over a 3-year spend in Austin, and we've raised 400 of the 500
to build
million.
What, more affordable housing, or
A lot of it is a lot more affordable housing. A lot of it is building to scale, the diversion activity, the rapid response housing, the emergency sheltering. But if you put somebody into a rapid response or emergency sheltering, it's only effective to the degree that you're actually pulling them out and moving them further along, or pulling them out and moving them into their own home. And cities that wait too long never can get back to building out the system that's necessary.
Right.
A lot of cities built out the system and were successful with getting effective zero with veterans homelessness, as was Austin, where you had to build out the entire system. But it was such a small component of the overall challenge. Yeah. But it did demonstrate to us the path forward.
Yeah, I mean, it's a very complicated issue, obviously, and here in Los Angeles, it's become a crisis, and it's a hard problem to solve because there are so many causes, and it becomes such a political hot button. So, how do you unite different disparate groups around different solutions?
Well, I mean, that was really kind of what set us on the path that we're on right now. The city council decided that the hiding the challenge was not getting us where we needed to go,
Right.
except in the short term. We gave, I think, 18,000 tickets out in 2016 to get people to move from where they were. And wherever they moved to, it was also against the law for them to be there, but at least they moved. The problem was very few of those people showed up in court the following Thursday to pay their fine. Now they had a bench warrant and they couldn't get a job or an apartment 6 months later. I mean, that didn't work.
Right.
And you should arrest and ticket people if they're creating a public health hazard or a public safety risk. But if all they're doing is experiencing homelessness, there has got to be a better way than putting them in a jail. So what happened in Austin is we let it come out. We let people see it. It was real disconcerting in our community. But what it did was it rallied our business community, our Downtown Austin Alliance on one side of the spectrum, and our Austin Justice Coalition and Homes Not Handcuffs on the other side, who had been spending the last 8 years arguing with each other over which version of the solution, theirs or ours, was the right one. And really what happened was we all sat down in a moderated, almost like a marriage counseling session, and came to the realization that, quite frankly, if we were successful at doing either of those two choices, it would still fail, that we actually had to do them both. So each of them became a really strong advocate for what the other had been advocating. And we were lucky in that we were doing it at the same time that the ARPA dollars were coming down from the federal government. So we had the ability to be able to put the resources to getting them both done.
So that type of consensus building is interesting. You're a business person, a former lawyer and business person who then became a politician. I don't know if you're okay with me describing it that way, but you became the mayor, which is an elected office. Here in LA, we have a noteworthy, prominent business person, Rick Caruso, who's running for mayor against some very experienced politicians, including national politicians. Tell us about that transition for you from the private sector into the public sector. What do you know now that you wish you knew then? What advice would you give to another business leader hoping to become mayor? And if he or she were to become mayor, what would you tell them?
Well, my perspective on it is a lot different than it was 8 years ago when I first got elected. I think everybody who's in the private sector watches the inefficiencies that exist in government and says, if we only had like a really good business person from the private sector coming in, we could do something about these inefficiencies. And the matter is that they can't. There are dramatic inefficiencies.
So it's not as simple as just putting a CEO in the mayor's office or the White House.
It's more than that because it's a difference in priority. So when you get into government, you realize that the priority is not efficiency. The priority is openness. The priority is participation. The priority is transparency. And every one of those things is inefficient and builds in inefficiencies.
Right.
But if you try to run government dropping any of those priorities, then the government's not going to be successsul.
Did you do anything early on? Sorry to interrupt. Did you do anything early on that taught you that lesson? I mean, when you first entered office, did you try to run it in a different way than you run it today?
Almost within weeks of getting into office. Austin has really strict campaign rules and really strict rules about raising dollars. We have a council that underfunds its mayor for staffing and its council members for staffing. They do a lot more work now than they had done in the past. I wanted to bring in some people with really great expertise in areas who are willing to take leave of absence for companies to come in. I wanted to bring in some really strong people. The budget didn't allow for it. I had a new council, did not want their very first thing to be increasing the size of staffs in council offices. So created a foundation that was incredibly transparent. Everybody, dollars in, dollars out, and where it was coming from and how it was operating.
And the foundation could hire staff?
The newspaper came out against it. There was some kind of pay-for-play option that was being set up, and I spent almost half of my goodwill from my newly elected position in trying to work too fast to change the what people were used to seeing.
Trying to find a hacky way
Right.
to bring great business folks into government through interesting.
Right.
So you retreated from that strategy and found other ways to try to recruit good people into your
and
office.
I had a lot of people that volunteered that came over to help, but it's not quite the same as being able to institutionalize it. And I think that, from the very beginning, because Diane and I are at a place in our lives where we weren't trying to launch a long-term political future. In fact, we were, with a group of people all trying to find somebody who would run for mayor 8 years ago, and the good ones all told us no until we locked ourselves in a room and said, okay, one of us actually needs to stop what they're doing and go do this. Diane and I drew the short straws. So, but if you're going to do that, if you're going to give up what you're doing in order to engage in this measure of public service, you ought to do things that are big. You ought to do things that are hard to do. You ought to do the things that will be disruptive, but transformative on the most serious challenges, and that's proven to be hard.
And what are you most proud of in your 7 years as mayor? Is that right?
Yeah, this is my 8th year.
8th year. So, what are you most proud of so far?
Well, it's Austin. Everybody loves living in Austin. No one wants anyone to come the day after they get to Austin. That's true of the people who got here 3 years ago, too, by the way. So in the 10 years before I got elected, I think the city had adopted the effective policy of not building infrastructure on the belief that if the city didn't build infrastructure, then people would stop coming. It doesn't work that way. People come anyhow, and you just don't have the infrastructure. The city had tried 3 times to approve a mass public transit system and had been defeated at the polls. I wanted us to really invest in mobility transportation infrastructure. In the 20 years before I took office, I think the total mobility transportation bonding was like $600 million over that 20-year period of time. And we have now $20 billion worth of infrastructure projects happening at our city. We're doubling the size of our airport. We're dramatically increasing the capacity on the state highway that goes through our downtown, burying it and capping it. And the voters in the middle of the pandemic last November voted to increase their property taxes so as to fund an underground mass public transit system that will be underground downtown.
I lived in Boston at the time that they did the Big Dig and did that, and then I lived in Seattle during the time that they also put the aqueduct underground. Similar projects ended up taking decades. And,
I was going to say you're bad luck, so you should not come to
but
Austin.
worth it eventually.
Right.
But hard to get funded and hard to get people excited about it at the time. You're a Democratic mayor in Texas. How do you engage in statewide issues and national issues, or do you try to just sort of keep your head down and focus on Austin?
I actually try to keep my head down and focus on Austin because there's not much margin in battling the governor of the state. But I'm not perfect at that. And I live in a state where the governor and the lieutenant governor really don't have any statewide Democratic foils for them to really go after. I don't think there's been a Democratic statewide office holder elected in the last 28 years, something like that. So all too often I find the lieutenant governor coming at Austin and its mayor because who else? And because we actually try to do things that are pretty progressive.
What are the issues that you sometimes cross swords with them on?
Well, policing would be one. I have been linked to defunding police, which I find an abhorrent concept, and always have and never did. But I can get caught up in the national and state debate. I find that some of my colleagues on the council on the left side really liked the characterization of defunding police because it helped them organize. And obviously the governor and the right like the thought of using that word. I mean, they love the word. On the day our council took its action, which was not defunding police, in fact, we spend more this year on police than we have ever spent in the history of the city. I responded to both sides by saying, we did some really good work yesterday as a council, but one thing we did not do was to fund the police. This was the very first day. But within 4 days later, no one had seen my social media posts. So I get caught in that. The homelessness issue was something that was real disconcerting for the governor. I have stood up for immigrants and refugees in our community. Some of the rhetoric that was coming out of both Washington and from state leadership, I thought was scaring people. We've done things like approved paid sick leave for employees in the city. But several of the things we do, the governor and state legislature then come behind us and preempt us and change it back.
And did you wade into any of the political debate around Trump and January 6th and the election, or that's a topic you stayed away from?
You know, I've generally stayed away from it. I have concerns about Trump. I have concerns about the loss of faith in the institutions in our country. I'm not sure what that end game is that turns out in a good way. I'm scared about changing secretaries of state around the country and the impact that might have had 2 years ago if those had been the people in place then. But generally speaking, I try really hard not to engage in a back and forth, except when I'm correcting facts.
Well, just as a great way to measure a CEO is by looking at the satisfaction of their employees, I like that one of the ways that you cited as sort of evidence that you've had a good term or terms as mayor is how satisfied your citizens are. And that is true. I don't think I've ever met anybody that lives in Austin that isn't an enthusiastic supporter of it, booster of it, and recruiter of others to move to Austin. So congratulations by that measure. You're certainly crushing it. And it's been impressive to watch. And as a booster of the LA tech scene here, I watch Austin jealously because Austin and Miami are all competing with LA for that coveted spot of who will take the mantle from the Bay Area, which is less and less every day the center of the tech universe, and more it's moving to other capitals like Austin and like Los Angeles. So it's been great speaking with you, Mayor. Thank you so much for joining Office Hours.
Good to be with you. Thank you.
That's it for this episode of Office Hours. I hope you enjoyed it. I'm your host, Spencer Rascoff. If you could leave a rating or review for the podcast, I'd greatly appreciate it. And always feel free to tweet at me on Twitter. That's @Spencer Rascoff. You can hear more Office Hours by subscribing on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever you get your podcasts. This episode was edited by George Macharko of the Podcast Editor. See you next time, and thanks for listening.